And joining us now on the line from Durham, North Carolina, Rachel Kranton. She is professor of economics at Duke University. She's also co-author of Identity Economics, How Our Identities Shape Our Work, Wages, and Well-Being. Rachel, it's good of you to join us on TVO tonight. How are you?
Very well, thanks. How are you?
Just great, thank you. I want to start just with some, let's go back to first principles if you like here. Why did you feel the need to develop a new way of looking at economics?
Well, good question. This work has been, George and I have been working in this area for quite some time now. I guess it's about 15 years. And as we started thinking about identity, we saw that it was very powerful in many areas of economics, yet economic theory and economic analysis had not yet captured the concept. So we felt that it was imperative to bring bring identity and social context into economics so that then we could examine systematically how identity and social context can matter to economic decision making.
Now you just dropped George's name there without telling everybody who George was, in case people don't know.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Is old Nobel laureate George, right?
Right, exactly. George Akerlof, a professor at UC Berkeley and a 2001 Nobel laureate.
So you're hanging with good peeps, I guess, is the way we want to put this.
Yeah, he's fantastic.
Okay.
We've had great fun over these years.
I'll bet. Tell us then, give us the basic definition. Identity economics then is what?
Okay, identity economics is a way of understanding why people make decisions. So a typical, it might be easiest to understand it if we contrast it to a typical economic analysis. So a typical economic analysis will think about people as having tastes or preferences. So you like bananas, or you like oranges, or you like a particular color or a particular kind of car, and then you make your purchases based on these tastes. What identity economics does is brings front and center the notion that we're also making these decisions based on who we are, who we think we are within the society. So we ask a second question, not just what are our tastes, but what do we think we should be doing? What is appropriate for us given who we think we are? So to give an example, we can all think of a very long list of things that's appropriate for men and appropriate for women, but not necessarily the other way around. And so what then it means to be a man or it means to be a woman in a particular society will have a great influence on the decisions, the economic decisions that people make. So identity economics is bringing identity and social norms into an analysis of basic economic decisions, like what to buy, where to go to school, how much to save.
If I can follow up from that, again with the male-female example that you just gave, might it be that, for example, men would be far more interested when it comes time to reviewing their contracts? They want to go for the biggest bump up in salary as possible, whereas a woman might want to consider whether or not there was childcare available at the location of her employer. Am I getting at something there?
Yeah, something like that. It would be if the society is telling women, for example, that one of the primary things she should be in life is a good mother, then she's going to have that in her mind when she makes her decisions. Of course, we could redefine fatherhood and say that fatherhood is not only about bringing home the bacon, but also about being with a child and spending time with a child. And then fathers, as we've seen now, start to look for those same sorts of things. So part of identity economics is to also recognize that these notions of identity and the norms that surround these different people whom we are, the norms that we have for ourselves are also changing over time. And we discuss them and we debate them, and they also become part of law, for example, in discrimination law. When we say, no, actually, we want to think of everybody as equal. That's quite a transformation if you think about it in human history. We now think that people should be treated equally at work. And then the notions of who we are and what's appropriate behavior change over time as well.
So that's the theory of identity economics. I wonder if you could take us through, I don't know, maybe one or two more examples of evidence that you have that this theory of yours actually does exist.
Well, why don't I take an example from something a little bit less obvious than gender. And let's take a look at workplaces. So we spend quite a number of pages in the book talking about workplaces. And let's contrast the military, and we studied the US military, and contrast military versus civilian workplaces. And if you think about civilian and military workplaces, you'll see that there's actually quite a big difference in how people in the military are trained and the incentives that they have to do a good job. And if we didn't have identity economics as a framework, we wouldn't be able to necessarily see these differences. So if we look at West Point, for example, the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, we see there's a great emphasis on training over those 4 years. And you might wonder, what is going on? Why are these recruits put through all of this? What are they actually being taught? A typical economic analysis would say, well, you're being taught how to shoot a gun, or you're being taught some military tactics. But much more is being taught there. What is also being taught there is the ideals and the norms for being an officer in the Army. And again, this is military academies across the world. We picked West Point because that's within our context, so we can understand it better. So once you see that work incentives are actually quite different in the military than they are in the civilian workplace. And so I guess that's a little bit of an existence proof, so to speak, that identity economics does have something to say about something that might seem less obvious, not race or gender, but it's about work and work incentives. So then once we take this contrast, now let's look at civilian organizations. Is it absent identity considerations? Well, actually, no. If you think about many successful firms, they are also inculcating a kind of affinity between the workers and their employers, which allows for greater work incentives, greater productivity.
Let me see if I can get you to do another contrast as well, because I think it was last year we had a guy who I think is a colleague of yours, actually, Dan Ariely. Is he at your university?
Yes,
I think he is, yeah, talking about behavioral economics. And I want, can you help us perhaps understand the differences between behavioral economics, which of course he feels is underpinning all of the decisions we make about financial things, and your identity economics?
Great question. They are related, and I think I'm a great fan of Dan's work, and I believe he's also a fan of our work. I think we can view behavioral economics and identity economics as complementary attempts to move standard economics beyond the picture of an individual rational actor model of human behavior. So behavioral economics is looking at systematic deviations from rational thinking. So, Dan has many experiments where he shows that people will make calculative errors in systematic ways. And the field of behavioral economics is looking at, one could say, cognitive biases or findings from cognitive psychology that show that people will make systematic errors, you might call them errors, in their decision making, or that they might start to value objects in a different way once they own them. That's a classic finding from behavioral economics. What we're doing is complementary, but we want to think about it as social psychology. So we're looking at the individual in the social situation and how the decision making is driven by social considerations or social psychological considerations. So when an individual is within a particular social situation, they may start to value objects differently, or they may start to feel differently about their work, for example, going back to the work setting. So behavioral economics and identity economics are very much complementary approaches to enhancing and giving a wider picture of what is going on behind people's decisions in the real world.
Let me pick up on one word that you used there, which was deviation, behavior that deviates from the norm. And one of the criticisms we've heard of behavioral economics is that while it has shown numerous ways that some economic behavior deviates from rational behavior, it doesn't necessarily explain why that deviation occurs. Can identity economics explain why that deviation occurs?
I'd say yes and no. So on behavioral economics, why that deviation occurs, I should say that there are efforts to try and uncover that. So there are people who are looking at brain processes, for example, and how people process information that may be different than our economic models represent. So there is a lot of work to be done to understand why. In identity economics, what we're looking at again is the social context. And at this point, we're categorizing reasons or patterns, I should say, as to how people make different decisions based on different social contexts. The why is still yet a big question, and I think for that we have to go sort of deeper into the biology of people and into the evolution of people to understand why we are the way we are. Why do people like to be in groups? Why do we feel that affinity to people who are like us? What we've done is taken, well, given that people like to be with people like themselves, and people divide themselves into groups, what are the implications of that for economic decisions? And I think the next step in the research is to go back and say, okay, now why is it that people want to divide themselves up in this way? It seems to be quite a strong force in people's interactions with each other to make these distinctions.
Okay, Rachel, let's put identity economics a little more under the microscope insofar as whenever a new theory trying to explain economic behavior and rationale comes forward, there are going to be those lining up to criticize. And I wonder what kind of criticism you've run into from colleagues, for example, who are looking at what you're doing and maybe not buying.
Good question again. Certainly we have had criticism. I guess we could say there's two major criticisms. One major criticism is something that's also been leveled at behavioral economics, which is that we've simply changed what people care about in our analyses, and therefore we can explain anything. So if I say that people care about looking like somebody else, well then I can explain anything by that. I can just change that particular basic in the model. And so there's a presumption, or there's a rule that you really shouldn't modify what we call the utility function. You shouldn't modify the basic motivations of people. What you should do is keep those fixed and then look at standard economic changes like changes in prices and changes in income. So in the other criticism that we've gotten is, I guess, a little bit more advanced, because now economists have started to accept that there may be different motivations. And we've now expanded that notion a bit beyond the comfort level of most economists. And so we're now expanding what we're saying are people's motivations into the social realm. And here we've gotten criticism in the sense that our view is that what motivates people, why I will make certain decisions, is based on very much who I am within a particular society at a particular historical moment, which means that may change. If I were born in a different era, my same person, me as a biological being, were born in a different era, I may have very different notions of who I am, who I want to be, and my decisions would be quite different. So that is quite challenging, because we're now saying that a lot of the determinants of economic outcomes and economic decision making is not coming from changes of prices and income, but is coming from changes in societal notions of who people are and how we should be.
At some level, that's just not that controversial a thing to say. Why would people object so much to you trying to put a new theory of economics on the table?
I don't think they should object, so it's a little bit of I'm trying to get into the mind of my colleagues. I think one reason that people find it challenging is that it is very difficult to measure and quantify. So how do we quantify a change in social norms? How do we quantify the identity inculcation at West Point? How do we measure that? We can ask people, but that's not the same. We don't have the same ability to measure that as we do, for example, to measure changes in people's incomes, or changes in or the levels of people's incomes, or the levels of people's education, or housing prices, and so on. So I think it's very difficult to measure these things. That's one issue. But actually, before that, it's very difficult to conceptualize identity and norms. And so what George and I have done, hopefully successfully, is distill this very difficult, very complex set of concepts from outside economics and try to bring them into economics in a way that with the kinds of methods economists are traditionally used to, so mathematical modeling and statistical analysis, we can incorporate something as very, very complex as social identity and social norms. So I think it's a matter of method as well as sort of a matter of taste, of what should we be studying.
Well, then let's take it to its logical extension. Paint a picture, if you would, of economics and what the consequences might be if, in fact, identity is not included, and you're wrong. What do you think the consequences of that would be?
If we're wrong, or if...
Yeah, let's say identity, let's take identity out of the mix altogether. What are the consequences for economics if it's not a factor?
Okay. Well, I guess I'd say that if identity is not a factor, then it shouldn't be in economics. But if identity is a factor and we don't have it in our models, then we could potentially be making very big mistakes. We could be making very big mistakes, for example, in education policy. So let's give an example of in the United States, there's a new move to reform the No Child Left Behind program, which perhaps you've heard a lot about.
Absolutely.
And this is a program about education reform. How can we get children to perform better in schools? But actually, the way the policies are posed is all about incentives for teachers and for schools. And it's all about monetary incentives. So teachers might get bonuses if their kids perform well, and principals might get promoted, and so on. And if identity doesn't matter, perhaps that is exactly the right conversation to be having. But if identity is important, then this whole debate is missing something fundamental, which is that the ultimate person that we're asking to perform here are the children in the schools and the teenagers in the schools. And we should be thinking, what is important to the children and the teenagers? Well, how do the children and the teenagers think of themselves? They're not I would say, not maximizing future income, right? That's not what is in their minds. They're not thinking about monetary incentives. They're thinking about fitting in. They're thinking about their social world. And so if we're looking at education, we should be thinking about the decision maker in this educational process, who is ultimately the child and the teenager, and what is motivating that person. And if we want to say, well, identity doesn't matter to teenagers, well, then our social norms don't matter to teenagers, of course, then we don't have much to say. But I would quite very much argue the reverse, is that what's paramount to teenagers and what's paramount to children is their social world and how they fit into that social world. And then the schools then need to pay attention to that very carefully when they are changing the educational system.
Gotcha. Interesting example. All right, let's take it the next step. How does identity economics challenge some of the sacred cows of economics?
Well, I guess, again, one of the sacred cows of economics is the presumption that individual tastes are characteristic of an individual. So I have my own personal taste. Again, I like apples, I like oranges, and we shouldn't discuss whether I like apples and oranges. It's just my tastes, right? And identity economics is saying, well, actually, people do discuss other people's tastes. It actually is something that is discussed and is debated. So apples and oranges might not be discussed and debated, but whether or not I should go to work and leave my children at home, which might be what I want to do, that's my tastes, right? I have a taste for a career. Maybe that's something I shouldn't do. You know, maybe that's just not, I would be being a bad mother if I were to do that. And so we actually have very large debates about what's appropriate and inappropriate behavior. So the idea that there are no debates about the underlying tastes and people's underlying preferences which lead them to make those decisions, that's a bit of a sacred cow. And one of the points we're making is actually no. We have huge debates and huge discussions about what is appropriate and inappropriate behavior. So gender is quite an obvious example, and race is another example, but yet we can also look at many other realms where we also are discussing what is appropriate behavior in that context. And then when we teach that appropriate behavior, then people start to adopt that as part of what they think they should be doing, which then affects economic decisions.
Let me, as we move on here, quote from David Brooks of the New York Times, that good old progressive conservative columnist as he describes himself. And here's what he writes about this. Economics achieved coherence as a science by amputating most of human nature. Now economists are starting with those parts of emotional life that they can count and model, the activities that make them economists. But once they're in this terrain, they'll surely find that the processes that make up the inner life are not amenable to the methodologies of social science. The moral and social yearnings of fully realized human beings are not reducible to universal laws and cannot be studied like physics. Once this is accepted, economics would again become a subsection of history and moral philosophy. Economics will be realistic, but it will be an art, not a science. What do you make of his argument, Rachel?
I agree with part of it, and I disagree with part of it. In some sense, I think that a lot of science is art. So to make this distinction between science and art is a bit of a false dichotomy. But particularly when it comes to economics, what George and I have done is we've tried to, in some sense, I think he's reflecting what we've tried to do is we say, okay, there's this richness within human behavior, and what we're trying to do is bring it into economic models in a particular way so that we can start to get a handle on it with the kinds of methods that we currently use, so mathematical modeling and statistical analysis. So the question then is, does that mean that economics is then going to blow up and no longer be what we recognize it is today? And that's where I would differ. I would say no. I would think that economics will expand but not blow up. So I think that there is a space and there's room for statistical analysis and there's room for formal modeling. What we need a bit more space for, or perhaps a lot more space for in economics, is the more historical types of analyses and the more rich kinds of case studies that George and I cite a lot in our book. And again, I guess I would argue that these should be parallel and complementary approaches to understanding people's behavior rather than conflictual. Every method, every way of studying a subject has its value. So if statistical methods can't capture something, well then perhaps we should use historical methods. But that doesn't mean that because we're using historical methods for some areas of economics doesn't make statistical methods just completely invalid. So I think that we need a wider space for understanding when we should be using different kinds of methods, and this will lead to a richer discipline.
Well, let's make the comparison to politics, because I've interviewed numerous politicians over the years who are, of course, political science graduates who say that once they actually get into politics, there's way more art than science in their political science. Would you make the same argument about economics, that there's actually far more arts to it than there is science to it?
I guess I would say so. So for example, even if we were to look at people who are writing down formal models, and in another part of my work I do much of that, I write down these mathematical models. I make many choices along the way to make that model represent something that I think is important. So I'm already putting in a lot of my own judgment or a lot of collective judgment from the field when I'm doing that exercise. And when somebody goes to, for example, test whether income or education is affecting health outcomes, so sort of a standard type of examination that labor economists might do, there's all sorts of choices that are already being made there. And so there's a lot of creativity, there's a lot of innovation that goes into these studies. I'm not sure I'm an art critic to know exactly whether we want to call that art or not, but just to say that there is a lot of judgment, there is a lot of creativity that goes into the design of all of these kinds of studies. So there isn't as if there is a universal principle in how one goes about these studies. There is a lot of individual innovation and individual creativity that comes to play.
In which case, let me thank you for discussing both the art and science of economics on TVO tonight. It was a great pleasure meeting you, Rachel. Thanks so much.
Well, thank you very much.